Hidden beneath forests, mountains, and beaches, Nazi bunkers were the concrete skeleton of Hitler's war machine. From the Atlantic Wall to the Führerbunker, these dark fortresses still whisper the secrets of World War II. If you love uncovering hidden history, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories from the past. The reality of Nazi bunkers is a subject that has fascinated historians, architects, urban explorers, and ordinary people ever since the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945. Built in an age of total war, these massive concrete structures represented the Nazi regime's obsession with control, survival, and the protection of its leaders, military assets, and civilians from the devastating air campaigns unleashed by the Allies. On the surface, Nazi bunkers look like lifeless, hollow shells of concrete, often half buried under the earth, some covered in moss or converted into museums, parking lots, or nightclubs. But the truth is that these bunkers reveal not only the military and engineering genius of the era, but also the psychological state of a regime that knew it was under siege, that recognized the destructive power of modern air warfare, and that desperately sought to outlast its enemies, even as its dreams of world domination crumbled. During World War II, Adolf Hitler and his high command recognized early that air power would define the nature of modern conflict. The German Luftwaffe had already demonstrated this during the Blitzkrieg campaigns in Poland, France, and the Low Countries, where airstrikes worked in tandem with armored divisions to crush opponents swiftly. But as the war turned against Germany, particularly after 1941, when Britain remained defiant and the United States entered the war, the tide of air power shifted dramatically. The British Royal Air Force and the American 8th Air Force unleashed a relentless bombing campaign against German cities, industrial centers, and infrastructure. From Hamburg to Dresden, Berlin to Cologne, the destruction from Allied bombers forced German planners to build underground shelters and fortified bunkers, not just for the population, but also for the continuity of government and military command. These structures became symbols of Nazi paranoia and resilience, and their ruins today still haunt the landscapes of Europe. The most notorious of all Nazi bunkers was undoubtedly the Führerbunker in Berlin, where Adolf Hitler spent the final months of the war, giving increasingly irrational orders as the Soviet Red Army closed in on the city. Completed in 1944, the Führerbunker was located beneath the Reich Chancellery and consisted of multiple subterranean levels, reinforced by massive layers of concrete. It contained living quarters, conference rooms, and facilities to support the Nazi leadership even during heavy bombardment. The bunker was designed to withstand the heaviest Allied bombs, and for a time, it served as the last stronghold of Hitler's regime. Here, he received reports of armies that no longer existed, moved imaginary divisions on maps, and issued decrees to generals who were either dead, captured, or out of communication. In this underground tomb, as the world above collapsed into rubble, Hitler married Eva Braun, dictated his last will and testament, and eventually took his own life on April 30th, 1945. The Führerbunker, though partially destroyed by the Soviets after the war, remains the most infamous bunker in history, representing both the delusions of Nazi leadership and the inevitability of their downfall. But the Führerbunker was only one example among thousands. Across occupied Europe and within Germany itself, the Nazis built an enormous network of bunkers. The Atlantic Wall, stretching from Norway down to the French coast, was fortified with bunkers designed to repel the expected Allied invasion. These coastal bunkers housed artillery, machine guns, ammunition, and observation posts, all encased in thick concrete designed to resist naval shelling and aerial bombardment. Even today, Tourists walking along the beaches of Normandy or the cliffs of Brittany stumble upon the ghostly remains of these bunkers, some intact, others crumbling, but still imposing, like fossilized monsters from another age. During the D-Day landings in June 1944, Allied soldiers faced murderous fire from these strongpoints, many of which held out for hours or even days before being neutralized. Yet, despite their strength, the bunkers could not stop the momentum of the Allied invasion, and the Atlantic Wall was breached. The reality was that no static fortification, no matter how strong, could hold back a determined enemy backed by overwhelming resources and mobility. In the heart of German cities, civilian air raid shelters were constructed, often doubling as bunkers. These were sometimes purpose-built, reinforced concrete towers known as Flak Towers, which not only housed civilians during bombing raids, but also mounted anti-aircraft guns on their roofs. These gigantic structures were some of the most impressive bunker designs of the war, with walls up to 4 meters thick and self-contained facilities, including ventilation, power generators, water supplies, and even hospitals. Families would crowd into these towers during bombing raids, listening to the thunder of anti-aircraft guns above and the terrifying drone of Allied bombers overhead. Unlike many other wartime constructions, the Flak Towers proved nearly indestructible, so much so that many of them still stand today in cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna, too solid to be demolished without immense effort and cost. Some have been repurposed into climbing walls, aquariums, or even cultural centers, while others remain sealed relics of the past. Their survival testifies to the engineering power of the Third Reich, but also to its misplaced priorities. Vast resources were poured into concrete fortresses that ultimately could not change the outcome of the war. Nazi bunkers also served as military command centers and weapon depots. In northern France, massive submarine pens were built to house the German U-boat fleet. The pens in Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, and La Rochelle were constructed with roofs of reinforced concrete up to 7 meters thick, rendering them almost immune to Allied bombing. These submarine bases became vital to the Battle of the Atlantic, allowing U-boats to sortie into the ocean and attack Allied convoys. Even after constant bombing campaigns, the pens remained operational until the liberation of France. Today, these colossal bunkers still stand, too difficult to destroy, and some have been turned into museums or cultural venues. They are stark reminders of the scale of Nazi military ambition and the lengths to which the regime went to protect its assets from destruction. The psychological dimension of Nazi bunkers cannot be overlooked. For the civilian population, bunkers and air raid shelters offered a fragile sense of security in a time of terror. The constant threat of bombing raids meant that families spent countless nights underground, huddled in cramped, damp, and often poorly ventilated spaces. Memories of these shelters lingered for decades after the war, especially among children who associated them with fear, darkness, and the thunderous sounds of war outside. For the Nazi leadership, bunkers symbolized not only protection, but also isolation from reality. Hitler himself became increasingly withdrawn into his underground headquarters, such as the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, from where he directed much of the war in the East. These bunkers created an illusion of invulnerability for the regime's leaders, allowing them to continue believing in victory long after defeat was inevitable. The construction of Nazi bunkers also reveals the darker side of the regime's exploitation of labor. Many of the massive bunkers, especially the submarine pens and underground factories, were built by forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners. thousands of workers toiled in brutal conditions, often underground, exposed to dust, poor ventilation, and malnutrition. Mortality rates were extremely high, as prisoners were worked to death building structures designed to prolong the war effort of their oppressors. The Dora Mittelbau camp in Germany, for example, was infamous for the construction of underground tunnels where the V-2 rockets were assembled. Prisoners worked in horrifying conditions, and thousands perished. Thus, behind the cold concrete walls of Nazi bunkers lies a human story of suffering and cruelty that should never be forgotten. After the war, the Allies faced the problem of what to do with these indestructible remnants of Nazi rule. Many bunkers were demolished or sealed, but others proved too costly or dangerous to remove. In Berlin, the Soviets destroyed much of the Reich Chancellery and attempted to obliterate the Führerbunker, but traces remained underground, hidden until rediscovered decades later. In France, the Atlantic Wall bunkers were left to decay, though some became attractions for military historians and tourists. In Hamburg and Vienna, the Flak Towers became permanent features of the urban landscape. Over time, these bunkers shifted from symbols of oppression to historical monuments, provoking reflection on the past. Some were repurposed, others preserved as museums, while still others remained sealed, their interiors untouched since 1945. Today, the reality of Nazi bunkers has taken on new layers of meaning. For urban explorers, bunkers represent thrilling opportunities to explore hidden spaces, to descend into forgotten tunnels where history seems frozen in time. For architects and engineers, they are case studies in durability, as their massive concrete walls have resisted not only wartime destruction, but also decades of weathering. For historians, they are physical evidence of the Nazi regime's militarism, paranoia, and brutality. And for society at large, they serve as haunting reminders of a past that must never be repeated. Walking through a Nazi bunker today is a sobering experience. The cold air, the thick concrete walls, the claustrophobic corridors, all combine to evoke the sense of fear and desperation that must have permeated these structures during the war. The mythologizing of Nazi bunkers has also fueled conspiracy theories and popular culture. Stories of hidden treasures, secret weapons, or even escaped Nazis using bunkers as last refuges have circulated for decades. In popular media, bunkers are often depicted as sinister lairs, underground fortresses hiding terrible secrets. While most of these stories are exaggerated or fictional, they reflect the enduring aura of mystery surrounding these concrete monuments. The truth, however, is often more mundane but no less important. Bunkers were tools of survival in a war defined by industrial-scale destruction, and their legacy lies not in myths, but in the sobering reality of war. Ultimately, the reality of Nazi bunkers lies in their dual nature. On one hand, they were marvels of engineering, built with astonishing speed and strength, capable of withstanding the mightiest weapons of the age. On the other hand, they were symbols of a doomed regime, fortresses built to protect leaders who had led their nation into catastrophe. They could delay the inevitable, but not prevent it. They were shelters for civilians, but also prisons of fear. They were workplaces for forced laborers, where suffering and death were daily realities. They were designed to safeguard the Nazi vision of the future. But today, they stand only as relics of its collapse. As long as they remain scattered across Europe, silent, immovable, indestructible, they will continue to provoke fascination, reflection, and unease. They remind us of the extremes of human ingenuity and cruelty, of the futility of war, and of the inescapable truth that no bunker, no matter how strong, can shield a society from the consequences of its own actions.